Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. As a Brazilian, when the election happened just last month in Brazil, it was really eye-opener for me. And one of the things that I started looking is for any kind of article or anything that was connecting with Brazil. And maybe Erica had an article that was talking about some of the things that the police in Brazil was already doing to educators and other parts in Brazil. And that got me really interested. And since she's an alum from Pitt, she was here for mid to late 2000s, right?
2005,
2005.
I finished my PhD in 2011.
11, yeah. So she's now an associate professor at political science at Iowa State University. She was also a recipient of our field research grants, I believe in 2007, 2 classes, and also got the nationality rooms from Pitt. So definitely one of our illustrious alumni that's here coming back home to actually talk about Brazil a little bit.
I guess my other connection is I got a certificate in Latin American
Also?
Latin American studies.
Social public policy.
Social public policy, yes.
Yeah.
Yep,
Yeah.
those are my connections.
Yes.
Yes, from here you can go anywhere, including Iowa State.
Yeah, there we go. And she has done a lot of research in Brazil and, always writing articles. She has a massive number of articles that have already been published and everything. So without further ado.
Thank you guys. I'm delighted to see so many people here and delighted to, be back at Pitt. I'm going to flip my PhD from here. Okay, so the talk today about this dude. Jair Bolsonaro, winner of the 2018 presidential election in Brazil. Greatest sometime evangelical. We'll talk more about what I mean by sometime evangelical in a minute. But he is he plays an evangelical on TV. He's sort of an evangelical. Sometime evangelical and upended Brazilian politics. This pose that he's making right here is a classic Jair Bolsonaro pose. He's known for making the sign of the guns. He's been controversial for teaching children to make a gun sign. I think in Brazil this is a more sensitive thing than I think it is in the United States. I think this motion may be more common in the U.S. than it is in Brazil. And in Brazil it's been taken as an indicator of his violence and his propensity to like arms. So, when I was looking for setting up this PowerPoint presentation, I was looking for some of the exemplary quotes. Many of you guys have probably read quotes from Jair Bolsonaro. There is an entire genre of articles with quotes, with offensive quotes from Jair Bolsonaro. There must be hundreds of articles on the internet with offensive quotes from Jair Bolsonaro. And what's most impressive about it is that they have different quotes. So like if you're looking for an offensive quote from Jair Bolsonaro about black people, you have your choice of different articles choose different things. These are the things that if you've read about Jair Bolsonaro in the popular media, the things that you've read about are probably his discussions of these offensive quotes. So for instance, he once told a female deputy that he wouldn't rape her because she didn't deserve it. When asked to elaborate, because is he saying people wanted to make clear what he was saying. When asked to elaborate by reporters, he replied, well, she's way too ugly to rape. She's just not, I'm not a rapist, but if I were going to rape somebody, it definitely would not be her. He has gone on record with believing in unequal salaries for women and men, because women take maternity leave. He thinks that maternity leave is an undue benefit for women. He is pro-torture. He said the dictatorship's mistake was to torture but not kill people. He's on record with all sorts of death wishes for politicians. Just realized I didn't turn off my phone. Sorry, guys. He he dedicated his vote for the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff to the head torturer. Dilma Rousseff, former president of Brazil, was tortured during the military dictatorship, and he dedicated his vote to his vote in favor of impeachment to one of the torturers, one of the lead torturers. Has said that he'd rather have his son die in a car accident than be gay. So it goes on and on. Yeah, so these are the things that you've probably read about in the popular media. Maybe, so while all of these are sort of inflammatory, they're eye-catching, maybe more interesting from the perspective of thinking about democracy in Latin America, and probably more concerning even than these inflammatory quotes, are his background and his history. So he comes out of the military, and he was trained in the military during the period of a military dictatorship. He was born in 1955. Military happened when he was 9 years old. At the age of 15, he became an informant for the military, spying on guerrillas. So he started to inform the military on the movements of guerrilla groups. He entered the military as soon as he could when he was 18 years old, went through the military academy. With the transition to civilian rule, he became something of an insurrectionist. He, in the late 1980s, in 1986, hyperinflation was going on in Brazil. He was upset about the loss in real value of military salaries. Published an op-ed in a famous national news magazine called Veja, complaining about the salaries. For this, he was jailed for 15 days or given a sentence of a jail sentence of 15 days for basically insubordination for publishing an op-ed complaining about his salary. He actually the judge got 100 telegrams of support for him after his sentencing. He was released a couple days later. Then, more interestingly, in a year later, he was being interviewed by Veja as he was campaigning for an improvement in military salaries under civilian leadership. He's being interviewed by Veja. And one of his compatriots reveals to Veja that he has a plot to set off minor bombs in military quarters and bathrooms on the military base in order to call attention to low salaries. So Veja decides that even though this is supposedly off the record, you can't admit a terrorist plot to Veja without and actually have it be off the record. So Veja decides to print this anyway. He goes to prison. He is dishonorably discharged in a lower court. This goes to the Supreme Military Tribunal, which and he's acquitted on the grounds that they couldn't prove that the diagram he had given the reporter was actually his handwriting, though later it was actually shown that it was his handwriting. Anyway, he was acquitted and allowed to, and reinstated, re-honorably non-discharged, I guess. So he was reinstated in the military. So he has this history of, comes out of the military, and history of insubordination against the military under civilian leadership. Quote from his commanding officer during the time says, "He was constantly trying to lead the lower ranking officers and was always repelled, both because of his aggressive treatment of his comrades and because of the lack of logic, rationality, and balance in the way of his arguments." Oh, so there's his op-ed in Veja. There's a diagram that his comrade gave to the Veja reporter. So in other words, we're talking about a guy who has who has very strong loyalty to the military under the military regime, to sort of the military that comes out of the military regime, and has a questionable sense of the relationship between the military and civilian leadership. And this is who Brazil elected. So, questions I'm tackling in this presentation are, how did we get here? What led to this, the election of Jair Bolsonaro? And the second question, the one that I'm not fully able to answer, is what does this mean for Brazilian politics in the future? Where are we going from here? That's the one hanging in all of our heads as we're thinking about this. So, political scientists have a pretty clear idea of what this means. Scott Mainwaring, this dude, Harvard political scientist, says he can't think of a more extremist political leader in Latin America. Stephen Levitsky, of the famous book How Democracies Die, is really, really worried that Brazilian democracy will die under Jair Bolsonaro, and has been shouting from the rooftops for months, or was shouting from the rooftops for months about, don't elect this guy, this is how democracies die. When I wrote the book How Democracies Die, I was talking about Jair Bolsonaro and I didn't even know it. So he has been shouting this. Did anybody pay attention? Yeah. On the other hand, so we've got political scientists, 2 Harvard political scientists telling us that this guy is a real danger. We have incredibly vehement supporters. Jair Bolsonaro is known as the myth. His followers have called him, have nicknamed him O Mito. So he has this extremely loyal, charismatic following. His supporters have come to be called Bolsominions, which is to say, like minions following Bolsonaro. This is a Bolsonaro supporter celebrating after his election with a t-shirt that says, "My party is Brazil," and the guy behind him is holding up a sign that actually says, Bolsonaro is the people. You can't get a more populist statement than that. On the night of his election, not only do we have supporters celebrating in the streets, but we have military in the streets celebrating as well, which is illegal, actually. So we have, these are supporters cheering a military vehicle parading in the streets. So, how did we get here? So, what led to his victory? And do people care at all about Brazilian democracy? Or what are Brazilians thinking about their democracy? So, this is a work in progress, obviously. We're a month out from Brazil's election. And I've been thinking about this and reasoning this through. So I'm looking forward to you guys' feedback. My argument in a nutshell, here's what I think happened. We've got a combination. Bolsonaro's vote share is a combination of what we might call fundamentals, leading to that would have made almost any candidate would have given almost any candidate in his shoes a pretty good shot at the winning of the election, plus a whole bunch of extra special stuff. So on the one hand, we've got there were structural factors built into this electoral campaign that made him, particularly in the second round, a very, very, very good candidate, or gave him a very good shot at winning the election. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that he adds in on top of it, some of which detract from his vote share, like the fact that we have people like Stephen Levitsky shouting from the tops of the roofs about how this guy is a threat to Brazilian democracy. So some of Bolsonaro's special things that he brings to the electorate detract from his vote share, and some of his special things he capitalizes on new demographic and issue-based cleavages that are essentially latent in the Brazilian electorate and that have reshaped the Brazilian electorate and given this pattern of voting behavior that has never existed before in Brazil. In the process, we've ended up with new demographic cleavages that have never existed before in Brazil and new issue cleavages that have never before existed. Okay, so what is my evidence here? I have 2 sources of evidence that I'm drawing on. The first, I've been conducting a 4-wave panel study. It's an online study. We're calling it Brazilian Democracy in the Balance. It actually will ultimately be a 5-wave panel study. We've already conducted 4 waves of the panel, conducting them all online. So we're interviewing the same people over and over again. We've conducted 4 waves in July, early September, and then like the week leading up to the vote, which is late September, early October, and then November. Unfortunately, the sample is not perfectly representative. Online samples in Brazil cannot be perfectly representative because because poor people don't have internet access or sufficient quality internet access to be able to, to be able to answer surveys. But we're using quota sampling. The results I'm going to be presenting to you, this is a caution, the results I'm going to be presenting to you have not yet been weighted. That's a statistical thing behind the scenes. Yeah, take everything with a small grain of salt. That said, even with population weighting, the results should not change dramatically. I'm also going to be presenting results and arguments from my book, which is forthcoming with Cambridge. So, in 2014 and 2017, I conducted studies in congregations in University of Pittsburgh, a small city. Conducted a whole range of data collection. Clergy interviews, obviously Bolsonaro was not a candidate at this time. There was a whole bunch that, the mobilization and issues that were building within congregations that led to the campaign are obviously fed into his win. Clergy interviews, participant observation, focus groups, quantitative surveys. The city that I observed, where I conducted the field work, is University of Pittsburgh, which Barry Ames has made famous. We've had the Pittsburgh tradition has a whole bunch of work in this one particular city, and again, largely based on our esteemed professor. University of Pittsburgh has the advantage. I had studied from my own personal perspective. University of Pittsburgh had the advantage of that I already knew the city very well from having done dissertation field work there and for having done work for Barry in the city of University of Pittsburgh. From the perspective of religion and politics, University of Pittsburgh is a nice city to study because I was really interested in studying congregations, what was happening within congregations, and I just needed a place where I could find a whole bunch of churches, which is basically any place in Brazil. University of Pittsburgh looks pretty much identical to Brazil in terms of religious distribution. Okay, so the fundamentals. So, especially in the second round, given that Jair Bolsonaro got into the second round, any opponent to a PT candidate was very likely to win. So Jair Bolsonaro had the good luck, the good fortune from his perspective, to be facing off against a candidate from the Workers' Party, the PT, Fernando Haddad. So, to understand where we got in the Brazilian politics at the current moment, we need to understand the performance of the PT. So the PT, the Workers' Party, center-leftist party of the former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, had won the previous 4 presidential elections. President Dilma Rousseff, the last PT president, maybe the last PT president for good, who knows? The last PT president, Dilma Rousseff, had been run out of office in 2016, been impeached. The performance of the Workers' Party had been pretty abysmal for about the past, between 2 and 4 years of her term in office. So she did win re-election in 2014. The economy was in recession, or the economy went into recession under Dilma Rousseff. Massive corruption scandals, of course. The PT, those of you who know Brazil, will say, well, the PT wasn't solely responsible for the corruption, obviously. Nonetheless, massive corruption scandals exploded under the PT's watch. So the PT was a tainted party. Widespread public pessimism. I have a working paper with a co-author who ran a bunch of qualitative interviews to ask people about their perceptions of Brazilian democracy in 2017. One of the most poignant quotes we got from these interviews was a guy who said, it's a sort of complicated business, I think, not to have hope. I never thought about leaving Brazil, but if I did not have family here, I would have already gone. There was a kind of real serious pessimism towards the end of Dilma Rousseff's term and after Dilma Rousseff's term. Under these conditions, any candidate from the Workers' Party or the PT would have had a very hard time winning the election. And at the same time, the Workers' Party also had a very strong base of support, had a sufficiently strong base of support that it was going to be hard for the PT not to get into the second round. So on the one hand, there were a lot of petchistas who were going to support any petchista candidate and who got Fernando Haddad into the second round. And then on the other hand, it was going to be very hard for a PT candidate to win a majority of the vote. There is a long, hardcore base of anti-petista, that is anti-PT sentiment in Brazil, and it has grown in ferocity. All of these performance-based factors have, not surprisingly, intensified the base of anti-petismo and drawn a lot of people into this sort of opposition to the Workers' Party who previously were, sort of on the fence or didn't have many partisans in it. Okay. So those are the fundamentals. If you had pit Fernando Haddad against any cardboard candidate in the second round, that cardboard candidate might well have won the election. Had a pretty good shot at winning the election. Bolsonaro added a whole bunch of other stuff. On the one hand, some of them hurt him, probably within the electorate, and some of the others probably helped him. Or he capitalized on latent cleavages that nobody knew existed in the electorate because nobody had been talking about them before. So on the one hand, democratic system attitudes. So attitudes towards democracy, support for democracy, affected people's vote choice, in part because elites were talking about democracy. So because people were framing the vote for Bolsonaro as a threat to democracy, there were people who were probably turned off from his candidacy because of the concern about the threat to democracy. Law and order attitudes also mattered a lot, tremendously. At the same time, he created kind of demographic cleavages that had previously not been capitalized upon in the Brazilian electorate. That in many cases were latent demographic cleavages that no politician was speaking to. So race, he exacerbated and polarized voters on the basis of race. We're going to see some very strong effects. And then religion. I'm going to spend a lot of the time talking about religion because, well, that's my deal. So, as a result of all of this, we see what political scientists would typically call a demographic realignment, except it's actually a demographic alignment. It's not a realignment because, in some senses, voters were not aligned on these grounds before, and now suddenly they are aligned on these grounds. So what we end up with, I'm going to show you models in which the Brazilian electorate looks startlingly like, say, a Republican electorate in the United States. We see results that look almost like the results from the U.S. 2018, looks like they could be from the U.S. 2018 midterm election, which is extraordinary for those of you who know something about Latin American politics or Brazilian politics, where these kinds of cleavages have not been latent until now. And it's extraordinary that we have two very different political systems with very different political histories, very different histories of race, very different histories of religion that seem to be converging. I don't know why this, I could speculate a lot about why this is happening. I don't have good theories right now about why this is happening. But we have this sort of movement towards sort of what we think of as kind of a set of culture war cleavages that looks strikingly American. Okay, so first I'm going to talk to you about, something went wrong there. Evangelicals and politics in Brazil. Okay, so Brazil is historically a Catholic country, has had but beginning in about 1970 or so, began a demographic transition that has been gradually accelerating over time. So what I'm showing you here is Brazilian census numbers. In 2010, evangelicals were measured about 22% of the population. Demographers project that it's going to be about 30%, that evangelicals are going to be about 30% of the population, around 30%, maybe slightly over, in the 2020 census. The census numbers are generally considered to be the best numbers. So we don't have numbers extending out to here. So this is really a very rapid. So in 1970, 9 out of every 10 Brazilians were Catholic. Today, that number is probably the Catholics are probably a very slight majority of the population. We're talking probably a little over 50% of Brazilians identify as being Catholic today. Not surprisingly, given what we know about trends in religion in the United States and in other places in the world, not surprisingly, this trend has been more pronounced among young people who are leaving religion altogether, and especially leaving Catholicism at a particularly profound rate. These are young Catholics. The Pope visited Brazil in 2014. So these are young Catholics who are devout, but a very small proportion, a relatively small proportion of Catholics, of young people are Catholics. So we find young people leaving Catholicism, entering evangelicalism, and also moving towards, to some extent, moving towards religious non-affiliation. And at the same time, the Catholic Church maintains all sorts of cultural infrastructure and sort of like cultural symbolism that give the church important resources. So two of the most important symbols of Brazil are Catholic. The Catholic Church maintains lots of physical infrastructure, which on the one hand requires lots of income and resources to maintain, and on the other hand constitutes an important source, an important resource for the church. So that's what the Catholic Church has. So what are these groups? This is a sign from outside a Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, which is perhaps the most politically important church, Pentecostal church in Brazil, in the city that I was studying Cristo for. So what we have here is a schedule of worship services at the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God. Segunda is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. What you can see is that the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God is offering 6 worship services a day. You could spend the entire day attending church. Since I was doing field work, I did spend the entire day attending church. But people are going to church a lot. The Evangelical and Pentecostal churches are, I've estimated that they have at least, people spend at least double, Evangelicals and Pentecostals spend at least twice the number of hours per year in church as Catholics do. As a conservative estimate, it could well be 3 times as many hours per year in church as Catholics do. So people are attending church a lot. This is a flyer handed out by the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, which is offering you basically miracles. So the churches are into providing miracles. There's all kinds of, there are many selective incentives. Political scientists talk about selective incentives, which are things that will encourage people to contribute to a social movement or a cause. One of the major selective incentives that evangelical and Pentecostal churches are able to offer to participants is the offer of miracles. So we've got spiritual selective incentives happening, or supernatural selective incentives being offered within evangelical and Pentecostal churches in ways that substantially, what?
We're just supernatural.
Yeah, supernatural, spiritual selective incentives happening in evangelical and Pentecostal churches, which are keeping people in the pews and maintaining their loyalty. Everything from cures of dengue, you're going to get a faith cure of dengue, to all financial rewards, fixing your relationships, making your husband come back to you, making him love his mistress. All of these things can happen through evangelical and Pentecostal churches. So you have an incentive to attend and to give your money.
How many hours is it that they spend in church? You
How
said
many?
people, how many? Is it
So-
1 versus 2 or 100 versus 200?
Okay, so I did these calculations based on survey data several years ago. So we're talking the average evangelical, the median evangelical is, I'm ballparking here, but probably attending service twice a week. The evangelical Pentecostal is probably attending service twice a week, and each service is probably about 2 hours. So the median evangelical is probably attending about 2 hours of service a week. That's a guess. And yeah, those numbers could be wrong, but yeah, that would be where I would ballpark it. Yeah. Plus, of course, attending service is fun. They've got lots of music. It's entertaining. The music is much better in evangelical and Pentecostal churches, particularly if you're into electronic music. Or okay. not going to talk through this complicated figure. Basically, this figure, the sum total of this figure is that there are not many demographic cleavages in who is converting. Once upon a time, there were lots of demographic cleavages. Back in the 1970s and 1980s, poor people were converting. At this point in time, we really don't have demographic cleavages. It's all about age and time. Time is the most important predictor. In survey data running over a course of like between 2008 and 2018, year is the single most important predictor of your adherence to evangelicalism, which is to say that everybody is converting across all strata. Young people are converting more quickly than our older people. Okay. So at the same time, we have growing evangelical activism. This has been going on for years. So how many of you guys know this? Okay, so this is a guy who ran for state office in the state of Paraná, for state representative, basically, state deputy. So the pun works better or the play on words works better in Portuguese than it does in English. But basically, he goes by Clark Kent, except crente is a Portuguese word for believer or like evangelical. So this is Clark the Evangelical with a play on Clark Kent. So we have evangelicals running for office at a growing rate. We also have prominent pastors prominently endorsing people. So in Brazilian politics has legislative or electoral laws that in some sense mimic the U.S. Johnson Amendment, if you guys know what that is. The U.S. Johnson Amendment is the amendment that allows, that prohibits campaigning within churches. It's a law that in the United States, churches that engage in political campaigns can lose their tax exemption, their income tax exemption, which is a substantial penalty and substantially reduces the amount of politicking that happens in churches in the United States. Brazilian electoral law has something similar, but the penalties are much more minor. We're talking like basically a slap on the wrist, a minor fine that's easy to pay, and for that matter, you probably won't end up having to pay it anyway. So churches, ostensibly politicking is prohibited in churches. There's a fair amount of it that goes on, as we will see in a minute. We also have prominent pastors outside of church walls are allowed to use their free speech rights to endorse candidates. So this is Pastor Silas Malafaia, who's actually strongly affiliated with Jair Bolsonaro, endorsing people in a campaign. We've started to see evangelical candidates winning executive office, and as well, Jair Bolsonaro would be the biggest example of this. So evangelical activism has extended to, there's a March for Jesus, which is largely an evangelical event, though in alliance with Catholics. When the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God opened a large new temple, the largest Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, like establishment, congregation, in the country, was recently opened several years ago in Sao Paulo. All the political notables of the country had to attend. So here are like presidents and candidates lining up to attend the opening of the new church. We even have Catholics affiliating with, so this guy here is a Catholic senator who has affiliated himself with the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God and actually got involved in basically laundering money to help the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God. So Jair Bolsonaro participates in all of that. Here we have him. So Jair Bolsonaro is an interesting guy who is the only politician I am aware of who manages simultaneously to be evangelical and Catholic. He identifies that, of course, religion is an identification, and people should take you seriously whatever you say you are. So he tells people that he's Catholic, but he basically, in every other sense apart from personal identification, he is essentially an evangelical in that he's been attending evangelical churches for more than a decade. He's married to an evangelical woman. He and this evangelical woman were married in an evangelical church. And here's a picture of him being baptized in the Jordan River by a very prominent evangelical politician. evangelical pastor politician. So this is in 2016 that he was baptized in the Jordan River. After he was baptized in the Jordan River, there was a lot of sort of political commentary at the time. Oh, now Jair Bolsonaro has become an evangelical politician. But no, he continued to tell everybody he was a Catholic. It just so happens that he's attending a Catholic church and has been baptized by an evangelical pastor. Okay, so I'm going to skip a lot of the theoretical background of the book, which isn't important for this talk, for understanding Jair Bolsonaro. But we can think of evangelicals in terms of a relationship among clergy, congregants, and in-group politicians. Focusing on clergy behavior. So, focusing on clergy behavior. What happens with evangelical clergy behavior? And to what extent do evangelical clergy and Catholic clergy get involved in talking about politics? So in the congregational study, we interviewed about 400 evangelical and Catholic clergy members and asked them which of these topics do you talk about? We found a very large divide. The single most important divide that we found between evangelical and Catholic clergy was in their discussion of homosexuality. So evangelical clergy were much, so we have here standardized responses, where we standardize them on a scale, and evangelical clergy responses were Catholic responses with respect to homosexuality were far below the mean response to homosexuality, or the mean among clergy as a whole on talking about homosexuality. So we found this very, very large gap between evangelicals and Catholics in talking about homosexuality. In general, Catholic clergy tend to be more politically leftist. They tend to talk less about hellfire and damnation. They tend to talk more about things like the need to care for the poor. They tend to say that they focus on the importance of, say, care for the environment, other kinds of things. So, yeah, Catholic clergy, there's also a gap in terms of discussion of care for the environment, whereas Catholic clergy are more likely to prioritize care for the environment than are Catholic clergy. But the single most important cleavage between Catholics and evangelical clergy is on homosexuality. Catholics and evangelicals are also talking a lot about candidates. So across various elections, I've run surveys asking Catholics and evangelicals, so this is from national level data. In 2 different national level surveys, I asked Catholics and evangelicals, to what extent do your clergy talk about politics? Or to what extent do your clergy endorse candidates? Do your clergy endorse or support any candidate in the most recent election? The interesting thing is that, first of all, we find that about 40% of evangelicals, 30 to 40% of evangelicals will say that their church leadership has endorsed clergy. Many of them will not actually report who will endorse a presidential candidate, and only about 5% or so will say that their clergy have, 5% of Catholics will say that their clergy endorsed candidates in these 2 elections. A lot of the evangelical Protestants did not actually report who their clergy were reporting or were supporting, but we found, like, if you just ask are they supporting somebody, we'll find actually between elections, across elections, somewhere between 15 and 30% of Catholics or evangelicals or Protestants are supporting candidates. The interesting thing about this, up until now, is that all this politicking in church has not had any particular ideological direction. Well, evangelicals have been much more conservative, evangelical clergy have been much more conservative on homosexuality, and to some extent on some other issues. We have not, up until 2018, found a cleavage in the electorate or divide in the electorate on which parties they support. So Catholic clergy had historically exhibited some preference for the Workers' Party or the PT. But evangelical clergy were really split across many different candidates, some of whom were evangelical, some of whom were not. and almost seemingly without much ideological direction. So if you look at sort of at the elite level, at which parties evangelical clergy are aligning with, it seems to be more about group interests often, or up until 2018, it often seemed to be more about group interests than about any particular ideological bent within the alliance. So all of that changed in 2018. In 2018, in this online survey that I've been running, again, I asked people, did your clergy support any candidate, and if so, who? In 2018, almost everybody who said that their clergy supported a candidate said that their clergy was supporting Jair Bolsonaro. There were, among evangelicals, there was pretty much nobody who said that their clergy were supporting Fernando Haddad, and among Catholics it was actually pretty small too. So here is just the percentage saying that that their clergy were supporting Bolsonaro. We see that about 40% of Catholics in my survey said that their clergy were supporting Bolsonaro. Now, by the way, there is some drop-off between clergy reports of supporting candidates and congregants reports of supporting candidates, because some people don't pay attention to what the clergy are saying. So if you look at survey data from clergy and congregants in the same congregation, you will find drop-off over time. So more clergy will say that they are supporting candidates. But it's harder to get a sort of a nationally representative sample of who clergy are supporting from a national clergy survey. So if 40% of evangelicals say that their clergy are supporting Bolsonaro, it's probably substantially more than that who are actually, substantially higher than 40% of clergy who are actually supporting Bolsonaro. Okay, so what's driving this change? There's a massive change in the way evangelicals and Catholics are aligning with politics, where before they had some issue-based cleavages, but there was not really a cleavage in terms of partisan politics. Now we find that all of these, what was sort of a latent issue divide, has become a divide that is very strongly expressed at the ballot box in terms of who clergy are supporting. Unfortunately, I don't have a good answer to the question I just wrote. I'm working on it. Part of it is that Bolsonaro is himself identified with the evangelical movement. Despite his insistence that he is a Catholic, he is still strongly identified as being an evangelical. And part of it, very likely, is that he has figured out, as somebody who has been strongly tied to the evangelical community for decades now, or for over a decade now, as somebody who's been very strongly tied to the evangelical community, he understands the issues that mobilize evangelicals and has been able to capitalize on those issues. So what are those issues? Those issues really relate to the question of homosexuality, gender issues, more than anything else. We'll talk more about that in a bit. So we've got all of this happening. Jair Bolsonaro has been building this support. At the same time, paradoxically, we also have voters in the abstract saying that they don't support, that they don't like clergy talking to them about politics. So in 2014, in the La Paz Americas Barometer, we asked respondents, to what extent do you think that it's appropriate for religious leaders to endorse candidates in church? And only about 15% of Brazilians said that in the abstract they believed it was important for clergy to endorse candidates in church. And interestingly, we found no difference between evangelicals and Catholics in endorsements of Catholics in endorsements in church. So what this means is that their clergy have historically had to be somewhat reticent about endorsing candidates. Even while they're endorsing candidates, they've historically had to sort of like pull back a little bit, not be as overt about endorsing candidates as they might otherwise be because of congregate rejection of clergy endorsement candidates. Okay, so turning to congregates, how do congregates respond? There's what we call in scholars of communication, political communication, often talk about sort of a caricatured hypodermic needle model of political communication in which messages are injected into the unwitting subject who must absorb them whole cloth. we don't typically use the hypodermic needle, so we typically use the hypodermic needle metaphor to talk about political communication via the media. But often when we're talking about communication in churches, there's this sort of implicit assumption that if the clergy give a message, then everybody just accepts the whole cloth. That doesn't happen. So in part because congregants are reluctant to accept clergy messages and don't think this is normatively appropriate. And in part simply because there's all kinds of other drop-off and conflicting messages that affect how people process messages. Okay, on the one hand, in the book I find that in survey experiments, if evangelical clergy say that you shouldn't vote for somebody because they support gay rights, evangelicals will respond. So that's pretty clear. Catholics, not surprisingly, don't respond to messages from evangelical clergy saying you should support gay rights. So this is from a survey experiment where we primed evangelicals with a message that said, your clergy say you shouldn't support somebody because they support gay rights, or your clergy just say you shouldn't vote for that candidate. We find that clergy endorsements or lack of endorsements, clergy opposition to a candidate does have strong effects across various kinds of treatments. But, so there is some acceptance, and at the same time there's also rejection. There's this ambivalent relationship between congregants and clergy in terms of accepting the messages. More importantly, church effects extend far beyond clergy. What's happening in churches is not just that clergy are saying, you should go vote for X, Y, Z, and everybody says, okay, yeah, I'll go vote for it. It's not a hypodermic needle effect. Churches are able to influence voters, and particularly evangelical churches are able to influence voters because people are spending a lot of time together. And when they're spending a lot of time together through small group ministries, Bible study, all sorts of things, they're constructing a shared worldview. And in this shared worldview, they are coming to consensus about the candidates who their church should support. So I find that level of doctrinal conservatism and more doctrinally conservative churches in 2014 were much more likely to cohere on a candidate. They would choose different candidates. They weren't necessarily all choosing a candidate, but through the process of discussion, so one church might choose candidate A, one church might choose candidate B, but it was a process of discussion that was leading to a convergence of the vote choice among members within each of the individual churches. So when we see clergy endorsing candidates, what's really happening is that the clergy endorsing candidates is just an outward sign of a dialogical process that is happening within churches. And often, in fact, we find that clergy are endorsing candidates whom the majority of their members have already converged upon within the church. Okay, so we find some influence from clergy, but it's a lot more nuanced than we would expect, or than one would think from a hypodermic needle model. So where does this all lead in terms of politics? So I'm showing you data up through just 2017. This is heading towards 2018 and the election. So what we find is that in general, across, between evangelicals and Catholics, we have very few issue cleavages on, say, economic issues. Evangelicals and Catholics look very similar on things like support for the environment, attitudes towards economic policy, and they look somewhat different on abortion, a little different on abortion, and they look very, very different on gay rights. So once again, at the mass level, among congregants, we find that the biggest issue that underlies divides between evangelicals and Catholics is the question of sexuality and abortion. Historically, we have not found much division in terms of partisanship, where support for the PT, here we have support for the PT, which is the most important part of interest party identification in Brazil. Historically, we've not found much divide in terms of partisanship, but as the PT started to collapse and lose support in the late 2010s, we started to find that evangelicals were leaving the PT much more quickly than Catholics were. Okay, so where does all of this lead us? All this leads us to what, in my book, I'm calling Brazil's culture wars. So the culture wars are a result of really sort of it's a battle between two sides. So on the one hand, much of what has triggered the culture wars is a rapid movement leftward in the political space in terms of liberalization of gay rights, legalization of gay marriage, increasing liberalness on gender issues, increasing recognition of things like transgender issues. So all of these cultural changes have induced a very strong backlash. And this difference that is most pronounced precisely on sexuality and gender issues has led to a lot of political conflict. So in the 2018 election, we find these are viral memes, 2 different viral memes. One, Fernando Haddad. So we have here, these are both false, by the way, false stories that circulated about the PT candidate, Fernando Haddad. The first one up here, Fernando Haddad is basically saying, when your child turns 5, we're going to make them the property of the state and we will determine your child's gender. It's up to us to decide if your child will become a boy or a girl. So this is a viral meme that was circulating through anti-PT networks in Brazil. Down here we have another viral anti-PT, anti-Haddad meme that was circulating that said that Haddad, when he was mayor in Sao Paulo, had created baby bottles that looked like penises, with the tops shaped like penises that he gave to children in daycare centers in order to, I don't know, breed tolerance of homosexuality, I think was the logic. But if you give a child a baby bottle that's shaped like a penis, they're going to become more tolerant of homosexuality. The logic is not totally clear. but there was a viral meme circulating about Haddad. So these things are laughable and funny and kind of shocking, but they speak to a real underlying anxiety among Brazilians, and particularly among evangelicals and Pentecostals, about sexuality and gender issues. And these things went viral precisely because they spoke to the issues that are most deeply felt and that most strongly polarized the electorate. So similarly to the way in the United States we talk about the things that go viral that are related to race, because this is a latent cleavage or a non-latent cleavage in the US electorate. In the Brazilian context, these things are going viral because they're speaking to a fundamental underlying anxiety about sexuality and gender that sells in some way, that is helping Bolsonaro win voters. Okay, let's get this one. Okay, so that's what's going on with religion. And we have all of these other things happening at the same time. I'm drawing to a close, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this. We have cleavages along democratic attitudes towards the democratic system. We have, in the simple models that we started to run, predicting the 2010 vote choice, or 2018 vote choice, support for the right to bear arms is the single strongest predictor of of support for Jair Bolsonaro, more than anything else. So attitudes about homosexuality are really important. We also find, for the first time, really strong cleavages on the basis of race and on the basis of religion. Overall, what this leads to is a polarization and realignment of the electorate. So,
What's the cleavage on race? What, if you could just say something
Yeah.
about that
can I show you some coefficients? in it?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, so demographics matter a lot. So we find this is a prediction of the vote. We find that, so in the Brazilian context, we have basically a tripartite racial classification scheme that has, there are, in addition, I'm not showing you the coefficients for indigenous and Asians, and actually we don't find much for indigenous people and Asians. We don't find much effect of indigenous or Asian identification. But we find that people who self-identify as being brown, somewhat less likely than those who identify as white, to vote for Bolsonaro. Very strong effect of self-identification as black. We vote for Bolsonaro, and also strong identification as evangelical. So we're looking at a set of demographic cleavages that is very new in Brazilian politics, and that looks really like sort of a, to use a US 2018 midterm kind of polarization of the electorate. So we've started trying to explain what's going on with this. What explains all these demographics? Why do we find these demographics in the electorate? The answer is that we can explain away some of these coefficients, some of these effects, and some of them we can't. We can explain away the gender effect and the effect of being about self-identifying as brown, pardo. So we can explain away the effect. We can understand what's going on with women and with pardos, and we can't explain away the effect of evangelicalism or the effect of self-identifying as black or preto. Which is to say that these are very strong cleavages that we have not yet fully identified the causes of. Okay, so what's going on with women? The answer, so we find some differences between women and men on basically attitudes towards gender roles. Those are not actually the basis for women's slightly lower preference for Bolsonaro. Interestingly, women's lower preference for Bolsonaro is driven entirely by their attitudes on the right to bear arms. So men are more likely to support the right to bear arms, and the right to bear, once we control for the right to bear arms, the coefficient for, the statistically significant coefficient for gender goes away. So it's all, the gender cleavage in Brazil right now is all about men's greater support for arming themselves than women's. Among blacks and browns, we controlled for a whole bunch of racial attitudes. Racial attitudes very strongly predict the vote choice. We controlled for attitudes, so we measured basically what would, in the US context, be called racial resentment, which is to say that you have a question asking, do you think that Afro-Brazilians get unfair treatment and get lazy because of the way they're accommodated by the Brazilian government? People who agree with that statement, much more likely to vote for Jair Bolsonaro. We also ask about people's attitudes towards, I'm not going to explain it, but towards quilombolas, which are basically sort of reservations for escaped slaves. So attitudes towards quilombolas, which is basically an Afro-Brazilian group, also very strongly predict voters.
And who votes for that? Who says yes to the
Okay, so
first question?
So people who, like residents of quilombolas, these are basically reservations, essentially indigenous, they're kind of like indigenous reservations for escaped slaves, but they're racialized, this is a racialized concept. So people who like quilombolas are much less likely to vote for Jair Bolsonaro. On the other hand, people who agree to the first question are much more likely to vote for Bolsonaro.
No, but are they blacks, browns, or whites?
So there is a racial cleavage and racial resentment. Black people in particular, people who self-identify as black, are much less likely to believe that blacks get lazy from receiving government benefits. So blacks are much less likely to believe that blacks are lazy, or that receiving government benefits makes black people lazy, and they are also, and this is part of why blacks are less likely to vote for Jair Bolsonaro, but it does not explain the full effect, racial effect. So here are a whole bunch of controls. And I can actually show you those coefficients in a second if you'd like as well. So gender role conservatism doesn't matter at all for his vote, actually. But it's the right to bear arms that is strongly shaping women's attitudes towards Jair Bolsonaro. Racial resentment, quilombolas. Jair Bolsonaro also campaigned on the platform that a good criminal is a dead criminal, which is a long-standing sort of expression in the Brazilian politics. But was politicized and made really prominent in his campaign. This has obvious racial connotations in the same way that it would have in American politics, and a good criminal is a dead criminal is going to end up with more black and brown people being killed than white people. So attitudes, agreement with the statement that a good criminal is a dead criminal also increases support for Jair Bolsonaro. Have I not answered your question?
No, I'm just puzzled because, if blacks are not supposed to vote for Bolsonaro, and the blacks and browns are a vast majority of the population, but Bolsonaro got almost 50% of the votes. So then I don't understand.
Yeah. So there are lots of brown people, actually, who are willing to agree with many of these people who self-identify as brown, who are willing to agree with many of these statements. And that's probably part of what's going on, is that there is a difference between people who self-identify as brown and black.
Would it also have to do with the fact that increasing number of Afro-Brazilians are identifying as evangelical? So I mean,
yeah,
how
so
did
that
you
would
break
also be the
apart?
case. Yeah, so that would also be the case. Okay. So the upshot of all of this is this demographic realignment, where for the first time we see a gender cleavage. So here I'm predicting something for the PT candidate because we've had a PT candidate in all 3 elections. So this is the most consistent vote choice. So I'm comparing vote choice in 2010, 2014, and 2018, support for the PT candidate. For the first time, we see that women prefer the PT. For the first time, probably in Brazil, since Brazil's 1985 democracy, we see that women prefer the PT. We see growing racial cleavages. And we find a very strong effect of evangelicalism on support for the vote in Brazil. Okay, so that's where we stand with the Brazil. The answer is I don't know. We have a new, Jair Bolsonaro has managed to find demographic cleavages that didn't exist that helped him win the Brazilian election. Will future politicians, has his successful model of campaigning shown the way for future candidates? Unfortunately, my bet would be that perhaps so, that these kinds of demographic cleavages are likely to continue in Brazilian politics because they can help win elections. At the same time, evangelicals, besides the racial and gender divides, evangelicals were incredibly important for Brazil, for Jair Bolsonaro's win. Jair Bolsonaro would probably have lost the election without evangelicals in the electorate. It would probably have narrowly lost. And the evangelicals tipped him over the top. So where this is headed is in terms of increasing the increasing power of evangelicals both as a lobbying force, and they will lobby hard for their own interests, and the increasing importance of evangelicals as a voting bloc, which for the first time has really shown its power in Brazilian politics. Okay, that's what I got for you. Questions? Yeah, John.
The presentation you're given focuses primarily on sort of issue-based analysis. I'm not a Brazilianist, I'm a Russianist. But what's most striking about reading about his campaign is he clearly represents himself as a messianic figure. And I have a sense that this messianism has a particular...
His middle name is Messias, right?
That's right. I mean, his messianism is a way of bringing all these things together among a population which in itself has a messianic orientation. In other words, the messianism is a way of bringing all these things together in this sort of persona. So he hasn't quite represented himself as Jesus Christ again.
Yeah, but there's kind of charismatic populism.
Yeah. Does that make any sense or not?
There is a very strong charismatic populist sort of orientation to his candidacy. Yeah, you're right, absolutely. There are people who love Jair Bolsonaro, love him, and see him as the embodiment of democracy. Interestingly, looking at, so this panel study that we put together, is the overarching goal, so that you didn't see any of that here, but the overarching goal of our study is to understand how attitudes towards democracy and attitudes on a whole range of democratic attributes shape voting for an authoritarian candidate, and in turn how the authoritarian candidate shapes democratic attitudes. Interestingly, I have some preliminary evidence that I was just looking at this morning, that it seems that among his supporters, we find an increase, it looks like there's a little bit of an increase in support for democracy among his supporters, but from before the election to after the election, which is to say that people are happy with democracy. His supporters become happier with democracy when they see their guy elected, which makes sense. Yeah, so there is a kind of charisma there. Can I explain it? No. Yeah, there is. Yeah. Do you have a further question?
No, nobody's been able to explain charisma.
Yeah.
It's simply a category.
Yeah,
We have.
you're right. Yeah, you're right, absolutely. I would say that certainly among evangelicals in particular, there would be that strong sort of need for a charismatic figure. And probably this has been exacerbated by the disillusionment with the PT. Brazil had a moment where level of disillusionment with politics is so high that there was sort of a psychological need for a messianic or a charismatic populist figure. Yeah.
The right to bear arms, of course, is in our Constitution. But this is the first I heard that there was a question of that here. Is that something new, and where is that coming from? Like, where is there a right to bear, like, what's all that?
There is a limited right to bear arms in Brazil right now.
In the Constitution?
No, not in the Constitution, it's just legislation.
Legislation.
And at the same time, the legislation is not necessarily supported. I mean, so in some sense, this is a symbolic issue because one can probably obtain a gun if one really wants one in Brazil, no matter what. And particularly gangs have lots of guns, but there is an interest in sort of loosening the right to bear arms, I mean, liberalizing the right to bear arms, and so liberalizing it and increasing the number of guns in circulation. And Jair Bolsonaro has been really pushing this idea that people need to arm themselves to be able to combat criminals.
Oh, so
Yes. So the right to bear arms has been on the agenda very strongly. He has pushed the right to bear arms onto the public agenda in a way that it really was not before. It was in a limited sense, but not very much.
And so, as I understand, this was one of the major issues,
Right.
because the middle class and the lower middle class got tired of criminality
Right.
in Brazil, and therefore, when Bolsonaro says, we're gonna finish off those people,
Right.
of course, you first finish off those people, then you finish off those people, and then you finish off those people. But these people over here are very happy to finish off those people over there, right?
Right.
And I think that discussion of
Right. Yeah.
the right to bear arms is because of the rampant criminality
Right.
that
Yeah. So this
has
is tied in.
been happening in the last few years in Brazil, increasing crime rates.
because of that, a good criminal is a dead criminal.
Right.
Well, so in Brazil,
Yeah, so-
at least, when I lived there, it started with a good politician is a dead politician, a good lawyer is a dead lawyer, a good criminal is a good. I mean, Brazil is
Brazil is into killing people.
no, it's into making jokes into about everything, right? So this, I think, it may reflect, and I don't know how to separate the Brazilian humor from the sentiments of the people, because there is a lot of stuff that Brazilians say just because it's a funny joke, and
Yeah.
so it's in my sentiment, right? So I'm not a scholar of this, so that particular quote, there is a good X is a dead X because and fill in the variable that you want, just anything bad that happens, that's the.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so you're right. Brazilians have very good senses of humor, and their sense of humor is very black. My sense is that this stuff about a good criminal is a dead criminal is pretty serious.
And I think that it goes in waves, right?
Yeah,
So it's, and I don't know if it is, you talked a lot about the religion, and in the end you said the evangelicals tipped it over. But there is this black versus white issue, or the non-white, which is a large population, and so that I was curious about that, and also about the religion. The evangelicals are only 20%, so.
They're close to 30%, yeah.
And so there is they may have helped, right? But there's a whole lot of other people who voted for him as well, right? So
Yeah.
it would be interesting to be able to tease out who are the populations. It's the same phenomenon as my feeling is the same phenomenon as, why did Trump get elected when all the polls said, no women and no black people and no Latino will vote for them, and then all of a sudden, he gets elected, right? So.
Okay, well, so first of all, any winning candidate, anybody who manages to get over 50% of the vote in a country the size of Brazil, the US, is going to have a wide coalition of many different groups that vote for him, or her, him. And, so the coalition that supported Jair Bolsonaro is diverse and heterogeneous, and other people's analysis, not mine, actually suggests that without evangelicals, he would have lost the election. That based on all the other religious groups, he would have lost the election, and that it was evangelicals who gave him the election. And nobody ever thinks that 100% of women or blacks are going to support any group. And obviously the politicization of these groups, the extent to which a group is cohesive depends a lot on processes happening within the group itself. And historically, interestingly, that's been one of the reasons that people have said that race doesn't matter in Brazil, because there's not sort of, there's been a small, but very small, sort of black movement, and there has not been much sort of racial or ethnic identity in Brazil. So it's interesting that Jair Bolsonaro managed to find a racial cleavage that didn't exist despite the lack of sort of an organized black movement. There was a question over here.
Yeah, I have a question in terms of whether you think, so whether we can apply some of the concepts in Levitsky and see that how democracy is starting to be right? So I was thinking, to what extent, so you talked about evangelicals and voter preferences. So in terms of the political system, so I have a thought that there are two things that are potentially applicable to this case. One is the question of lack of mutual recognition in the party system towards the end of the Dilma Rousseff term, in the sense that right after she won, her win was legitimized, and the impeachment was a very shady kind of affair. So it was kind of perhaps a case of lack of recognition of her victory, and so how like the PT was essentially shown as a party, and then how the opposition essentially supported a guy that was at least as corrupt as she was right in the end. So in a way, like the political system delegitimized itself, plus then did not work as a gatekeeper against someone like Bolsonaro. So you can have people like Fernando Henrique Cardoso saying, yeah, Bolsonaro is a not great guy, but he's better than the PT, right? And so there's a case, in my view, of lack of forbearance, lack of mutual recognition, plus lack of gatekeeping, right? And so these things, coupled with the perfect storm of economic decline, criminality, etc., kind of could have like propped up Bolsonaro as well.
I agree. Yeah, I mean, this is when I said, Steve Levitsky has been saying, he's been shouting from the rooftops, this is what I wrote the book, How Democracies Die About, and I didn't even know it. And that's essentially the argument. The center-right, say the supporters of Alckmin, the PSDB, essentially gave the election to Bolsonaro by climbing on board with him. They essentially failed their gatekeeping role. I was saying this earlier, that I thought, and I think many people did, many observers thought until maybe early September, that he was going to lose. And I thought that he was going to lose because the center-right was going to act as a gatekeeper and kick him out. But it turned out I was wrong. Yeah.
Just going to follow up on the question we were talking with Danielle before, and actually his earlier question about, and your answer, that a lot of the blacks have become evangelicals. And I'm curious if you have that number, because this is, I think, really interesting for you, because this is this cross cleavage. So which becomes stronger, your racial identity or your religious identity, because from what you said, that should pull in different directions. But that's all based in what Danielle said earlier, that he must have gotten an awful lot of black votes in order to win this election.
Okay, so actually most Brazilians identify as being pardo, not preto.
Okay.
So pardo
But they're
means
still the
brown.
ones that are being.
So pardo means brown, preto means black. And yeah, so for those who don't know the Brazilian context, somewhat over 50% of Brazilians identify as being Afro-Brazilian. The new census will give us a good number on it, but let's say 53% of Brazilians identify as being Afro-Brazilian. Most of those identify as being pardo, not preto. And we find a difference between pardos and pretos. The level of support for Bolsonaro among pretos in our data is very, very low. Extremely low, actually.
And what's the percent that identifies as preto?
in our, I can't tell you what it is in our data, but it's like a little over 10%. 15% maybe.
And that was
Most of-
among a population
So this
across the country?
Yeah, so this is cross-national, but again, this is where our data may be somewhat unrepresentative because it's an online survey. So blacks are going to have lower access to the internet because they're going to be in a poor strata. So yeah, we need to weight our data. It's still, we're still going to find a low, regardless of whether we weight our data, we're still going to find a very low percentage of blacks who support Bolsonaro. And yeah, so the weighting of the data, the population weighting of the data is not going to affect black support for Bolsonaro, but it is going to change the number of blacks we have in our sample. Yeah, so what's going on with what happens to black evangelicals? That is a really interesting question. The fact that we have such low support for Bolsonaro among black people
But even
suggests that we
brown-
have a lot of black evangelicals who are choosing not to vote for him despite their evangelical identity. Yeah, so it seems like probably among people who self-identify as black, there is a rejection of Bolsonaro on the basis of his racialized sort of rhetoric. Yeah.
So I don't know anything about myself, but how, in the US, the story is about turnout, right? So how is turnout, what's the turnout story in Brazil? Because I would, if it works like it does in the US, these black evangelicals just wouldn't show up.
So Brazil has compulsory voting.
But like really,
Sorry?
but like really, they don't all really vote.
Yeah, so about 85%, I actually don't know what the turnout, but do you know, Paulo? In this election? 81? Yeah,
It used to be mandatory.
it is mandatory. It is still mandatory.
It's more relaxed mandatory.
It's always mandatory, it's always been mandatory.
Fee that's pretty much 50 cents.
Sorry?
If you
Yeah,
do
the
not
fee is,
vote,
yeah, the penalty is very low.
it's very low.
The penalty is it's mandatory, but the penalty is very
I
low.
think it's greater for who wants to be a public servant,
Right.
because if you don't vote, you get punished. So it's
Yeah.
different between classes.
Yeah. And you also have things like, it's hard to get a passport, you have to like, so if you're middle class, the penalties are more severe. Unless you're extremely poor and really don't have money to pay for the penalty, then it's not so severe if you don't want a public sector job and those kind of things. So I have not looked at turnout in this election. In general, studies on turnout in Brazil suggest that there is an effect of race and class, but it's not a huge effect. And the turnout still remains pretty high. The cleavages are there, they're present, but they're not as large as one would expect in a country, as one that would normally be present in a country without compulsory voting. Also, Election Day is a holiday. Well, it's Sunday. It is both a holiday and Sunday in Brazil, which is an interesting thing from the perspective of studying religion and politics. But because everybody goes to church before voting. But it's, it's also, I think, increases turnout. Yes?
This may be an unfair question because it doesn't seem to be the thrust of your research, but I'm curious about intentionality. So one of the things we wrestle with, especially if we're making the comparison with the United States, is the degree to which this is a purposeful or remotely sophisticated policy versus buffoonery or the kind of lashing out of somebody. And
You mean campaign strategy, by policy you mean campaign
right,
strategy?
campaign strategy. And so I was curious about the data about the topics about which pastors were talking about. And I'm just wondering to the degree to which this was a carefully thought out strategy in your mind, or who's hitching who's, ride to which wagon, I guess. Are the pastors following Bolsonaro because they see in him advantages to them, or is Bolsonaro following the pastors because he sees in them advantages to him, if that makes sense?
Yeah, actually, this is the subject of my research that I didn't present.
Yeah.
But, yeah, so I can't tell, I mean, I studied clergy between 2014 and 2017, and I did not interview clergy in the 2018 election. What I can tell you is that clergy are choosing which topics to talk about out of this complex mix of strategic calculation and like sincere religious belief. And so on the one hand, clergy have very strong and relatively unbudging beliefs about certain core religious issues, things that include actually sexuality. So evangelical opposition on the basis of like evangelical opposition to homosexuality is one of those things that you can't get somebody to change their stance on. And on the other hand, clergy are strategically choosing what to talk about in part, basically on the calculation of what they think their congregants want to hear. So congregant reluctance to have clergy talk about politics will lead clergy to shut up sometimes. And likewise, I don't have evidence of it, but some anecdotal evidence from other things I've read from interviews with evangelicals suggests that in this election, clergy support for Bolsonaro clergy were often following their congregants in coming on board with Bolsonaro. So congregations were as a whole first citing that they supported Bolsonaro, and then clergy were sort of officializing, making official the decision that their congregants had already come to. So in some cases, this is not clergy injecting, we don't have a hypothermic needle message. It appears that in many cases, clergy were just following what their congregants had already decided. Yeah, hold on.
I was wondering about this paradox between the data from the Datafolha, maybe about how Brazilians support democracy, and then they vote with Bolsonaro's. I was wondering if maybe they just emulate his preferences, but doesn't make the change actually in reality. Like they,
Sorry.
like this. Like I don't remember exactly political behavior, but when the voter chooses our politicians that he's gonna cast a vote, and he doesn't have attitudes towards some questions about sexuality or gender or abortion, but they emulate these positions from the politicians. So maybe that's why you have the paradox, because I think the poll about democracy was like Friday, well, the Thursday and Friday before the election, and the election result was like Sunday. So they kind of, the same people, almost the same time, have different answers for the same problem. So maybe that's why they choose Bolsonaro, but they not actually, they say like this, oh, I choose him, but I don't like his positions. It's like maybe they separate his attitudes towards gender, minorities, but think about the empathy and all this thing about corruption, rather than think about attitudes as preference, as changing preference in population in Brazil. Maybe
Okay, so
can
you're
be explained in this.
So I think that what you're saying is that you think that attitudes towards democracy probably don't predict support for democracy attitudes towards democracy probably don't predict support for Bolsonaro because people are separating their democratic attitudes from their attitudes towards Bolsonaro. Yeah, so we do not find a huge effect of like support for democracy in the abstract on support for Bolsonaro. There's a small, statistically significant effect of support for democracy on support for Bolsonaro, but if you control for other things, it goes away. What we do find is that attitudes towards like sort of more what we would call core civic values or democratic values, such as tolerance, strongly predict vote for Bolsonaro. So on the one hand, so the question is, what are people thinking that democracy is? If democracy is elections, and you're voting for Bolsonaro and Bolsonaro gets elected, then maybe you like democracy. So it may be that attitudes towards democracy may not be so strongly linked to whether you vote for support Jair Bolsonaro because he is still a candidate within a democratic system. Yet other kinds of core democratic values might still matter. Yes?
just an impression that the passion that exists for Bolsonaro now is something similar, even though they're opposite figures, to the passion that was directed to Lula.
Right, I've remarked on that myself. It seems like, yeah.
My first question is whether you agree with that, and the second is, do you think that based on that, we're going to see a phenomenon of Bolsonarismo as we have seen for religion?
Yes, I think it's quite possible. I mean, I've remarked on the same thing myself, that it's like people's passion for him, it feels a little bit like 2002. I mean, not that I was paying attention to Brazilian politics in 2002, but based on everything I've read and seen, it feels like 2002. What happened in 2018 feels like 2002, which is the year that Lula won the presidency. Yes, I mean, there's a danger that his administration could crash and burn in a way that's tragic for Brazil, and if that happens, probably Bolsonarismo will take a hit. But if his administration doesn't crash and burn in a way that's terrible for Brazil, yeah, absolutely. Which is really interesting because he's been a politician since like 1988, and suddenly he's inspired this kind of passion. Yeah, you.
Can I ask a question about the rise of evangelicalism in Brazil? So how did the religion attract so many people from 70s to now?
That's a great question. There's a lot of literature on it. Part of the answer, back when sociologists were studying this in the early years of the evangelical movement in the 80s and 90s, the answer was often that basically evangelicalism gives people things they want. A lot of these supernatural selective incentives. I mean, everything from, so there's evidence that when sort of pretty good, rigorous statistical evidence that when a city converts to evangelicalism, when there's a mass conversion, incomes go up. Male incomes in particular go up. Particularly in small and relatively poor cities. And it seems to be because evangelicalism and Pentecostalism encourage low-income men to give up drugs and alcohol, in particular alcohol.
The question, the problem that I think she's raising is why now, not 20 years ago, or 30 or 40 years ago?
Well, why not 40? Well, so first of all, it's been happening for a long time. I mean, so the slow process of evangelism would mean that, I mean, this trend really began in the 1970s. And it's what we see now is just a gradual increase and movement towards evangelicalism, which happens through person-to-person evangelization. Why did it start in the 1970s? One, Neo-Pentecostalism, really powerful forms of Neo-Pentecostalism were basically invented or created in the 1970s. So basically prosperity theology, which began in the United States but caught on very strongly in Latin America, particularly in Brazil and in Africa. Prosperity theology sort of combined with Pentecostalism to create Neo-Pentecostalism. Universal Church of the Kingdom of God was founded. So these were just really effective forms of evangelization that took off in the 1970s. Probably also democracy. To some extent, democracy has helped evangelization, and that freedom of assembly and movement has helped evangelization. Yes?
So I asked that question because I'm wondering, so you said that the cultural wars are similar here and in Brazil, and I was wondering if it's because the religion was from here to Brazil and the ideas are the same and the religious connections are still, I don't know, are there still evangelical priests coming from US to Brazil now to give the cultural ingredients to the cultural wars in Brazil?
Yeah, so it's a good question. A little bit. The answer is a little bit to some extent. The major evangelical and Pentecostal leaders and denominations are Brazilian. Well, actually, the largest evangelical congregation is an international one, the Assemblies of God. So Assemblies of God has a huge church that is very international. The Universal Church of the Kingdom of God is probably the second most important and maybe the most important politically. Was created in Brazil and is headed by a Brazilian. And is really sort of a very Brazilian phenomenon. And many of the most important neo-Pentecostal congregations are Brazilian. Did they take some ideas that started in the US? Absolutely. I mean, yeah, the theology is international. It also has a Brazilian flavor. It's, you know, acquired Brazilian aspects. There are studies, for instance, of prosperity theology. Prosperity theology looks different in Brazil than it does in the US.
Yeah, this is just a hunch, but I'm wondering if the evangelicals are more pro-choice, or at least less anti-abortion than the Catholic Church. And during the Ebola crisis, when so many women were becoming pregnant and worried about, I'm wondering, like I said, this is just a hunch, if some women left Catholicism, if they wanted to have an abortion, if the evangelicals are more pro-choice, or just,
So
that's another reason.
You're talking about an Ebola crisis in Africa? Or
Zika.
Zika, I'm sorry, it's Zika. Zika. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so so first, are evangelicals more pro-abortion? Most of them are not.
No,
Most of the congregations are
pro-choice.
More pro-choice.
Because with the Zika virus,
Yes, right,
I know that a lot of those women were probably Catholic. And
Right, yeah. There was probably, I mean, I would guess it on the margins, there was a little bit of that movement, not a ton.
Not a lot.
And the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God used to be the only major neo-Pentecostal congregation that was like openly, sort of like enthusiastically pro-choice. It stopped talking about abortion, which I think is because the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God has decided to align itself with the political right in Brazil. And you can't align yourself with the political right in Brazil and be pro or pro-choice. So they've just decided to stop talking about the issue.
Well,
And I believe
pro-choice doesn't mean you have to use the word abortion.
Sorry, well, yeah, pro-choice, sorry. But pro-choice, yeah, the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God used to be enthusiastically pro-choice and is no longer talking about it. And I believe that it's, I don't have any evidence, but I'm pretty sure that it's because the Universal Church has formed political partnerships with the right, can no longer be openly pro-choice. And I strongly suspect that at some point they will change their stance on abortion because of their alliance with the political right.
That may be why some women left Catholicism.